when he came here, I had to say to my congregation, if you hear familiar things, it's because I've been lifting, sometimes with attribution and sometimes without, his stories and commentary for most of my rabbinic career. So yeah, he's a treasure. Okay, so it's just noon now, and people are still filing in, but I'll stop the screen share here so that I can put us on screen. So good afternoon, everyone, as you're joining us. We'll give it a few more minutes for people to join online. I want to welcome Yossi Klein Halevi to Vancouver, virtually at least. Yossi, it's good to see you. It's 10 o'clock in Israel, so as Yossi said, it's just about his bedtime, but we really appreciate you staying up for us. I know that we are... a pleasure. Thank you. It's ours too. So as people file in, I'm just going to just share a few announcements and some quick instructions. So first of all, if you'd like to ask a question during our webinar, you can use the Q&A function. Don't use the chat function. Use the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen, and you'll have the ability, if you see a question there that you like, you can just click on the thumbs up button next to it, and that'll allow you to vote that question higher up in the queue. Marielle and Ira, who's new to our staff, are going to be moderating the questions, and they'll pass them along to me. So the more votes one has, maybe the quicker your question will get asked. Also, to remind you that Temple Shalom is still very much a synagogue, even though we're not technically congregating. Services continue for the next 2 weeks at least, actually in the backyard of the synagogue at 6. And then beginning in November, we're back at 8:15 only online. On Friday nights, Saturday mornings are always online at 10 a.m., Minyan at 7:45 in the morning on Zoom. But we also have a lot of classes that are taking place. We have a movie series that's beginning next week, and all those details are on the Temple website. Our Wise Aging group just began today, I think. So join us for any of the things. You don't have to be a member. We just love for you to join us, and let us know if you like it, and then we'll find you for a donation later. So as we gather here, let me introduce and welcome Yossi Klein Halevi to our congregation. Many are familiar. As I was explaining to Yossi earlier, Temple Shalom has been running the Shalom Hartman Institute I Engage program for at least 6 years, maybe longer, since I arrived. I don't remember if I did it the first year I arrived or not. So 6 or 7 years. And Yossi is an eminent scholar within that program, and we've seen him on video. And we're thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you this afternoon, Yossi. So to provide for those that are less familiar with Yossi a bit of his bio. So Yossi Klein Halevi is the senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. And together with Imam Abdul, can you help me with his last name?
Antepli.
Of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Institute, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. One of my favorite books is actually a book that Yossi wrote in 2013, Like Dreamers, which won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. And his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and an updated version of that, as I was reading about, is a New York Times bestseller. He writes leading op-ed pages in the US, including for The Times, the Wall Street Journal, and is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. And I'll just skip down to the bottom here. In 2013, he was a visiting professor at Israel Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary. It's the Conservative Movement's seminary, and served as a writer in residence at the University of Illinois. He was a senior fellow at the Shalom Center in Jerusalem from the early 2000s till 2010. Born in Brooklyn, New York. You've maintained your Brooklyn accent a little bit, Yossi, and moved to Israel in 1982, where he lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who helps run a center for Jewish meditation, and they have 3 children. And I will share with you that though Yossi and I have not yet met in person, I have been sort of stalking him online for at least one, if not both of the decades or 3 of the decades of my rabbinate. I have frequently referenced his works with our congregation and draw on them for insights into what's going on in Israel and in the mind of Jews across the spectrum, and particularly your insights into the Israeli and Palestinian relationship. And so we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to ask some questions of somebody who would know the answers. to what's going on in Israel today, and how we can maybe make sense of what we see in the headlines in this world that seems to be a bit topsy-turvy. And Israel is always kind of on the scale of topsy-turvy. Maybe Yossi can help us understand a few of those things and bring some clarity to what we're reading. So Yossi, welcome. Thank you for being
Thank
here.
you. Thank you so much, Dan, and really grateful for you to have me. And as we were talking before the event, my daughter is in Deep Cove, so I have a very strong emotional connection to Vancouver. So really delighted to be here, even in this form, and hopefully my next visit to Moria and Yam, we'll be able to meet in person.
That would be wonderful, God willing, not only for our congregation, but that you'd be able to travel and see your daughter, and that we could live in a world where we can do that again. So
Yeah.
it'd be fantastic. So I'm going to dive right in with a couple of questions that I shared with Yossi in advance because I wanted him to have some time to think about them, and then we'll turn to your questions. And Yossi, again, please feel free to be as broad in your answers and go as deep as well as you'd like. Of course, our time is here to listen to you. So the first question I have actually is really sort of part of my introduction, which is, what's the mood on the street in Israel today? We see on the news protests over Netanyahu, protests over the handling of COVID, protests by and against the Orthodox. What's going on? And I'm probably leaving out some protests. Is Israel falling apart, or is Israel coming together?
Well, I think Israel is always falling apart, and it's always coming back together. That's certainly been the pattern of the Israel that I've seen. I'm in Israel now for almost 40 years, and there's always a crisis. There's always a big question mark over our future. Is this project viable in the long term? And we always get through whatever crisis is at hand, and then we deal with a whole new set of things. And what we're dealing with right now is definitely one of the hardest moments that I've ever experienced here. A convergence of crises, any one of which would be a major threat to the fabric of Israeli society, but to have 3 or 4 crises happening simultaneously makes this very worrying. If you're asking about the mood, everybody is anxious. Whatever your politics are, you'll have a different set of reasons for why you're anxious. So I'll tell you mine. In the order of priorities, my first and most acute source of anxiety is the threat to Israeli democracy, which is coming from the prime minister. This is the first time in our history where we have a sitting prime minister about to go on trial on no less than 3 counts of corruption. And there may be even greater scandals that have not yet come to court. I'm thinking specifically about the scandal over the submarine purchase. For those who don't know, this is literally today, this has emerged as the major debate in Israeli politics. There are many who suspect, including the former defense minister, Bogi Ya'alon, who are accusing Netanyahu of having been involved in what really might be the single worst case of corruption in Israel's history, which is alleged kickbacks in the purchase of submarines from Germany. And what makes this so appalling for many of us here is that we're talking about the security of the state. We're talking about submarines that will be used as our forward position against Iran. Our submarine fleet is actually our not so secret weapon against Iran. And to think that high level people in the security establishment were getting rich off of this deal, and that the prime minister himself might be implicated, allegedly, is creating one of the deepest crises of confidence that we've ever experienced here. Netanyahu is lashing out at democratic institutions. Literally today, the Likud Speaker of the House arbitrarily canceled the vote. The opposition managed to win, to impose a commission of inquiry into the submarine affair, and simply scotch the vote. We've never experienced anything like this before. Bogi Ya'alon, I just saw a clip with Bogi Ya'alon appealing to Israelis to go out into the streets to save Israeli democracy. I certainly would have never spoken with this kind of urgency before, and I feel it today. So that's before we get to Corona, before we get to the ultra-Orthodox, just today's news, right? Now, unpacking it further, we are in the greatest economic free fall that this country has been in decades. I moved to Israel when we were experiencing triple-digit inflation. It was the early 80s. It was South America style inflation, 300-400%. We're nowhere near that yet, but we're starting to see the stability we come to take for granted in startup nation beginning to shake. And then when you factor in the unbelievable incompetence of this government in dealing with Corona, which is due to political reasons. The 40% of the infection rate is coming from the ultra-Orthodox community, which has blatantly, not all, but much of the ultra-Orthodox community has simply ignored the health instructions and has adopted its own separatist health policy, trying to reach herd immunity. Now, you're part of a wider society. You can't do that. So in a sense, what we are seeing today is the poisoned fruit, the culmination of decades of indulging the ultra-Orthodox in their separatism. And just to play this out for one more moment, just how appalling this really is. You have the ultra-Orthodox community, which is about 30% of Israeli society today, which has separated itself from the responsibilities of society. Most ultra-Orthodox don't participate in the defense of the country. Most of the men, a majority of the men don't work. They sit and study religious texts, which means that the tax base falls on the rest of us. And so not only do the ultra-Orthodox separate from Israeli society, but because of political coalition considerations, we, the majority, the mainstream, are forced to subsidize their separatism. And now that social contract, if one could even call it that, because it's such a lopsided, imposed social contract, now we are literally paying a life and death price. We were the highest, proportionally, we had the highest rate of infection for Corona in the world until recently. So, and it's so ironic then, because as I'm sure you know, we started Corona as we were the success story. Everyone wanted to know, how did Israel beat Corona? And we did. And then, as so often happens in this country, we managed to turn victory into defeat. And a combination of arrogance, recklessness, bad politics, Haredi separatism, Netanyahu's desperation, trying to hold his coalition together, and essentially giving into Haredi blackmail. All of these factors combine to make us dysfunctional. And I think that Corona is a test case for Israel at its best and Israel at its worst. We're seeing it all play out. And really, I think of Corona as a moment of truth for humanity, for us, for each of us individually. How are you doing in Corona? Are you using the time well? Are you going out of your mind? You know? And the same is true for society. And so it's and what makes me hopeful, and maybe I'll just end on this note, is that this convergence of crises is forcing us to look at long festering trends. And we will not be the same society that we were pre-corona. And we have a real opportunity now to make things right. And the demonstrations that are happening in the streets are crucial. These are the best of our young people. And you know, it's so interesting because when I look at the images of the demonstrations in the States, for example, the left-wing demonstrations, and I compare them to our anti-government demonstrations, there's one crucial difference. Our demonstrations, the kids are flying the national flag. In the progressive demonstrations in America, you'll never see an American flag unless they're burning it. And in Israel, we have a passionately loyal opposition. And as long as that holds, I think the basic social cohesiveness will hold.
Wow, Yossi, thank you for that. There is so much in that answer. I was going to ask you about the protests and whether, how does change happen in Israel? Because we see the dysfunction in the political process, and we have seen Israelis take to the streets many times, and it's amounted to a lot of noise, but not a lot of change. So what's the tipping point here, I guess?
It's a great question. You know, we have had we have two precedents where a protest movement forced out a prime minister. First was Golda Meir, 1974, 6 months after the Yom Kippur War, and she was essentially hounded out of office by enraged war veterans who accused the Labor government at the time of having failed to prepare the country, prepare the military. The second time was when Prime Minister Menachem was hounded out of office because of his failure in the first Lebanon War. This was 1983. And what we're seeing now is the first attempt of a grassroots protest movement to oust a prime minister, not because of failure in war, but because of failure, well, in a different kind of war. And these demonstrations really depend on the deep breath, the ability of the protest movement to take a deep inhalation and have patience and create a public mood of delegitimization of a prime minister who, to my mind, has delegitimized himself and has then compounded his offense by waging war against our democratic institutions. Well, I think that, and there's one thing that I'll say about the demonstrations. I think are two things that I think are really interesting. I attended one recently, and it was such a moving experience for me to be with these thousands of kids. And the first thing that I felt was Israeli kids have a tremendous sense of humor. The slogans, the atmosphere, it was so much fun. I mean, people were angry. We're really angry. This is a very angry society right now. But there was so much good humor in the streets. Now, I'll give you an example. The prime minister's son, Yair Netanyahu, tweeted that the demonstrators are aliens, and he meant aliens as in ET, UFOs. The Hebrew word is that they're not from here. They don't really belong to Israelis. So that week, the demonstrators, the kids showed up in wearing UFO costumes, ET costumes. They were dressed as green men, and and it's like, just come at us, give us your worst, and we're just going to push right back. The other thing that I noticed at the demonstration was how Jewish the culture of protest is in Israel. I'll give you an example. Some of the kids brought giant golden calves to the demonstration to protest against the Netanyahu family's hedonism, or banners imprinted with the angry words of the prophets, of Isaiah, accusing the people of corruption, and you just, it's so deeply embedded in the society. And most of these kids are secular. And if you would have said to these secular Israelis, this is a really Jewish event, they might have been perplexed, because they might have said, wow, we're secular Israelis. This isn't religious. But it was so biblical. It was infused with Jewishness. And that's, I think, one of the great things about Israel, is that you don't have to try to be Jewish here. It's so instinctive that you need to point out to Israelis how Jewish they actually are.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Yossi. We could spend the entire time just on that topic. I would love to dive in more to the secular, Haredi divide, but I'm going to move us on, and maybe we'll come back to it. And there's some questions already popping up. And a reminder: if you want to ask a question of Yossi, put it into the Q&A, and we'll get to it there. The second question, Yossi, I wanted to talk with you about is this: your take on how the various new normalized relations with Israel is impacting Palestinian leadership, especially in regard to their willingness or resistance to enter into peace negotiations. And of course, we're talking about the UAE and Bahrain and those kinds of things.
So before we get to the Palestinians, I would just like to preface it by noting how extraordinary a moment this is for Israel in terms of our foreign relations. Once we step out of Israel proper, Israel's looking great. And we are seeing historic developments that were inconceivable even a few years ago. Look, just for a frame of reference, I don't know how old you are, Dan, but in 1973, Yom Kippur War, I was 20. I happened to have been a student here at the time in Jerusalem. I was on the one-year program at Hebrew U when the Yom Kippur War happened. And then the immediate aftermath was the Arab oil boycott. The Arab oil boycott turned the Jewish state into a pariah. Almost all of Africa broke off diplomatic relations with us in the weeks after the Yom Kippur War because of the Arab oil pressure. Western Europe turned against Israel as a direct result of Arab oil. It wasn't because of any sudden concern, humanitarian concern for the Palestinians. Israel, we found ourselves increasingly on the defensive. It was one of the worst moments in Israel's history, the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. And Arab oil was one of the great greatest threats that we ever faced. In today's news, there was a story that Israel has just signed an agreement with the Emirates to import oil from the UAE to Europe. We're going to be the middleman. And how many people stopped and said, what a moment. The Arab oil states, the Saudis, the Gulf states, Bahrain, which were driving the isolation and demonization of Israel a half century ago, are today driving normalization. So I read an editorial in the New York Times recently saying this isn't a real peace agreement. They were trying to downplay the agreement because it was Trump and Netanyahu. I understand the need to downplay it, but it is actually historically dishonest because the editorial was saying, well, is formally at war with these countries. We were in a life and death struggle with the Arab oil producing. And so to see the Arab oil states driving normalization is one of the greatest vindication that Israel has ever experienced. And the other piece of this, which really needs to be emphasized, is that this is our first peace agreement that's truly about peace. Jordan, Egypt, these were grudging, formal arrangements that had nothing to do with bringing societies together. I'm involved with people in the Gulf, and the warmth that's coming my way just for being an Israeli is something that I wish I would experience in parts of the diaspora. You know?
Why are you feeling that warmth, and why is that coming your way? What is underlying this?
I've been getting invited to. I was just invited to a conference in Abu Dhabi, and I was invited to participate in a publication that they're putting out. And there's so much ferment happening, economic, cultural. That they're desperate. And the reason for that, I think, is very simple. We are now more than a decade into the collapse of much of the Arab world. And here you have the Emirates, these wealthy, successful countries that are looking for allies in the Middle East. And so they're turning toward Israel for two things. One is for military protection, frankly, from Iran. And the second is for an economic relationship. They want in. They want to have a real peace with us. And so I think this is a fantastic moment. Now, to get to your question about the Palestinians.
Yeah.
For the first time in a very long time, I feel that there might be a possibility for, I don't want to say solving the Palestinian problem, that might be too big a word, but for moving us in a more positive direction. And that's because if you take the Palestinian-Israeli relationship out of its bilateral track and move it in a regional framework, something can happen that I believe can't happen bilaterally. Bilaterally, we are stuck, and I can say unequivocally, Israelis and Palestinians will not make peace in this generation if we're left to our own devices. Each side knows what the other side's red lines are. Neither side can meet the other side's red line. The reason we don't have peace is not because there is a misunderstanding, but because each side understands the other very well. But if you widen the lens and focus not just on Israel and the Palestinians, but Israel and the Arab world, which is how Israelis experience this conflict. We have a kind of split screen in our heads. One side of the screen is Israel versus the Palestinians. We're Goliath, the Palestinians are David. But the other side of that screen is Israel and the Arab and Muslim world. And there, the relationship, the dynamic is very different. And so the more that Israelis feel accepted by the Arab world, the more they feel that the region is ending its war against our existence and legitimacy, the more Israelis can begin to relax and then think about ways of solving the Palestinian problem. And look, the that for me is that right after the peace agreement with Bahrain and the Emirates, there was a poll release showing that for the first time in years, there was a plurality of Israelis in favor of a two-state solution. Not an absolute majority, but a plurality. And the number of I don't knows is growing. And that's very positive, and it's a direct result of feeling that the Arab war against Israel is winding down. So that's the hope. I see hope. And whether whether the Palestinian leadership is capable of saying maybe instead of always saying no, and rather than playing the victim card, actually showing up at the table and negotiating. That's an open question. The track record is not good.
Right. So if I understand correctly, and it's coming up in our question Q&A here too, your sense is that the UAE or Bahrain or maybe even the Saudis would play the broker in a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians?
Yes, would play the broker in several ways. First of all, economically, take responsibility for helping a Palestinian state get off the ground, and also reassure Israelis that a Palestinian state is not going to be the front line of a hostile region. Until things are not clear with Iran and Syria, I don't see Israelis giving up security control of the West Bank. That's not going to happen. But the settlement building needs to stop. We need to start rolling that back. This needs to be done gradually. Right now, we're moving in a direction of a one state. We need to start gradually moving the dynamic toward a two-state solution. But again, there's no quick fix here. We will need the input of Arab allies. And I have never used that term before as an Israeli. We have never had Arab allies. Egypt and Jordan were not allies, are not allies. The Egyptian media is one of the most anti-Semitic media in the world. But we now have Arab allies, the Gulf states, and I would say Saudis, who are understandably more reticent about normalizing relations because they are the custodians of Muslim holy places, and I think they're very wary of going out too far ahead of the Arab or Muslim consensus. But the Gulf states would not have made peace with us without the blessing of the Saudis. And so something profound is changing in the region. And I think we need to be paying attention not just to the Palestinian track, as serious as that is, but also to these wider developments.
Oh, interesting. We'll come back to that because there are some more questions on it, but I want to try to get to my third question, and then we'll come back to those that are online. And the third question I have is really more about Israel diaspora relations. And we have the vote that didn't take place yet, but might take place at the World Zionist Congress over the power struggle that's taking place in Israel is now playing out in that body as well. So the influence of Jewish diaspora, particularly liberal Jews, has been increasingly diminished over the years, I think, of the Netanyahu administration. And I think that that's largely connected to the rise of orthodoxy and the rise of right-wing evangelical Christians in the US. And when I would lead tours to Israel back when we could lead tours to Israel, it was really a question of who had larger tour groups, all the Jews of North America or these giant mega churches out of the Midwest of the United States. So I guess what meaningful role can and do Jews like me, progressive North American Jews, play in Israel today? What
Look, I think that this is really one of those examples of a long-term struggle. And I think that, look, I sit at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, which is one of the Israeli centers of religious pluralism. This is really, Hartman has become the home, as you know, for North American rabbis, primarily from the liberal denominations. And that's something I'm very proud of. Very proud to be part of that effort to to create that space where American Jewry and Israel meet most intimately. It's nowhere near enough. These spaces need to be drastically expanded. But what I've seen over the years in this relationship is, in addition to the built-in problems, and you mentioned the rise of the Orthodox and the rise of the right, also factor in that the overwhelming majority of Israelis come from families whose origins are in countries where Jewish communities did not experience religious pluralism, either Eastern Europe or the Middle East. 80% of Israeli Jews or more, 90% probably, from those two regions, neither of which knew what religious pluralism was. So Israelis don't understand religious pluralism. We have a great deal of Jewish pluralism in Israel, but it's ethnic pluralism. It's Jews from Kurdistan and Ethiopia and Russia and New York, and we all have our very different ways of ethnically living our Jewishness. But the level of religious pluralism, as you know, is minimal. So the question is, how do we expand the base of support in Israeli society for religious pluralism? I think that the liberal denominations need to start rethinking who their allies are in Israeli society and how to speak to Israelis. But first of all, in terms of how to speak to Israelis, don't use the language of religious pluralism. It sounds alien to most Israelis. Use instead the language of Jewish peoplehood and the language of Zionism. And when you speak to Israelis that way, and I have this experience, I'll speak to Israelis, to Israeli groups about religious pluralism, and I won't use the term pluralism. I'll speak about Zionism, and I'll say the promise of Zionism was to create a public, sovereign Jewish space that would reflect the totality of the Jewish people. And what we have done scandalously is hand over the keys to Judaism, not just to the Orthodox, but increasingly to the ultra-Orthodox, that part of the Jewish people that cares least about the totality of the Jewish people. And that is an anti-Zionist act. That's just one example. And in terms of who your allies are in Israeli society, one of the major mistakes I feel that the liberal denominations have made, is especially true for the reform movement, but not only, is to look to the Israeli left and even the hard left as its allies. Groups like Breaking the Silence or bestselling that are totally marginalized in Israeli society. I never encounter these groups except when I'm on a lecture tour in America. Then suddenly these are like major Israeli groups. They don't exist for all practical purposes in Israeli discourse. What does exist very powerfully here is the Israeli center. And that's the place where the liberal denomination should be looking for allies. And even, I would dare say, as difficult as this will be for many Jews, parts of the Israeli right are potential allies in the fight for recognizing the totality of Jewish peoplehood, which is how I would prefer to call religious pluralism. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Russians. You have 1 million Russians in Israel who are fans of the Orthodox establishment. And yet there's very little communication between North American Jews and the Russian community because Russians tend to vote right. And the Russian party, Lieberman, is a right-wing party. But why not start a dialogue with the representatives of 1 million Russian voters? Don't just look to the left, which is marginal. The Labor Party is disappearing. Meretz has 5 seats in the Knesset. There is no left. It's all center and right. These one last point, which liberal American, North American Jews must internalize. Israel is no longer divided between right and we are divided between right and center.
Mhm.
And that requires a major shift in the thinking of North America.
Well, I mean, that really takes us back to where you began, which is who's on the street, because those protests, I think, as you've said, I mean, that's the Israeli center that's out there. That is the reaction to the Zionist reaction to the Orthodox, the ultra Orthodox, not participating in the fabric of Israeli society,
Absolutely.
in Israeli society.
Yeah.
So you're right that Corona, is a lens, is an opportunity, right? Crisis and opportunity, um, for new alignments and for really, wholesale and systemic change that maybe could not have been achieved without those other types of crisis moments in Israeli history, be they wars, God forbid, and intifadas and those kinds of things. So this is an inflection point for sure.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's going to be really bad here in the coming months. It's just going to be terrible. But I do see the crisis very much as an opportunity.
Yeah. So let me turn to some of the questions that are popping up here on screen. And they all touch on things you've talked about. So this one from Noah Seligman, a member of our congregation. Netanyahu has courted and cultivated a close relationship with Donald Trump. How will a Biden administration change the political relationship, if there's a Biden administration, change the political relationship with Israel, given the frosty at best relationship between Obama, Biden, and Netanyahu?
Yeah, well, I think that Biden and Harris are more favorably disposed to Israel. I think that Obama had fought the relationship from literally day one. The first thing he did when he came into office was appoint George Mitchell as his special Middle East envoy. Day one of the first term, and John Kerry, who was obsessed with the settlements as the main obstacle to peace, ignoring all other factors. So there was that, and I think Biden and Harris will be a little less aggressive on the front, a little more chastened, maybe a little more humble in terms of their. Obama had an exaggerated sense of his capabilities, and Obama really thought he was going to bring peace, going to force Israel to make peace. It doesn't work that way. And so I hope that a Biden-Harris administration will, on one hand, reassure Israel of ongoing bipartisan support, and at the same time make clear to Israel that free hand with settlement building, which Trump gave Netanyahu, is over. That's going to be curtailed, I hope. What worries me is not the Palestinian issue, not settlements. I'm worried about the Iran deal coming back. And for me, and for a majority of Israelis, the Iran deal was an enormous security. I saw the Iran deal as leading almost inevitably down the road to a nuclear Iran. I felt that the insanity, frankly, the insanity of that deal, that trade-off, was that in exchange for Iran delaying nuclear breakout while remaining on the nuclear threshold, not having to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure, in exchange for that dubious concession, the international community would empower Iran to become the regional Muslim conventional threat, which is exactly what happened. Everything that we warned about happened, and worse. Iran today is in control, either directly or indirectly, of 4 Arab countries. look, the one truly unintended positive result of the Iran deal is the peace agreement with the Gulf states, because they felt exactly the same way that we did about the Iran deal. And so they turned to us for protection, not only against Iran, but against America, because they don't trust America. They did not trust American resolve on Iran. So there was this silver lining to this deal. But I'm actually desperately worried about the Iran deal coming back. And I think it's going to be the first big fight between Israel and a Biden-Harris administration. But again, I want to emphasize that the atmosphere will be better than it was with Obama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly heard Joe Biden speak many times, and he speaks differently about Israel than I heard Obama speak about Israel. He seems to really know the people in the place. I find in him, a great affinity for Israel, and I think an understanding more of the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, and I think he truly loves Israel.
Yeah,
he's a very warm man, and Obama is not a warm man.
Yeah.
And I think Obama loved Israel, and that's okay. You don't have to love Israel, but I always felt that Obama, in some way, identified too strongly as a liberal Jew. If Obama had any religious identity, I think it was really as a liberal Jew, and he over-identified, and he took on the grudges of liberal Jews against the Israeli right.
Right.
And that's what I felt was playing out.
Well, I mean, that goes to your point about, North American Jews aligning with the far left of Israel that is, pretty much, impossible to find in Israel today, but gets over prominent headlines in the work of our movement. Very, very helpful perspective, Yossi. Thank you.
You're welcome, Noah.
Let me turn to Charles. Had a question. Charles Cohen: if Netanyahu is forced out of office, won't Israeli politics still be hamstrung by its history of proportional representation and coalition governments with Haredi swing votes controlling the Knesset?
Yeah, we're going to have to be moving toward an adjustment in the system. Look, we have at least four major blocks in Israel, political blocks that reflect what we call the tribes. President Ruby Rivlin spoke about four tribes. There is the secular tribe, the ultra-Orthodox, the Arab tribe, and the religious Zionist tribe. And I think the map is actually more complicated than that. Because if you really start breaking down, we have tribes within tribes. And that actually is good news, because these are not monolithic groups that are squaring off against each other. But there's got to be some way where we can figure out how to reduce the blackmail, of the ultra-Orthodox parties. And I don't understand the political system to give you a learned answer of what change might look like. It's one of the changes, certainly, that I expect to come out of the period is a law limiting prime ministers to 2 terms. That is, that for sure has to be the immediate takeaway of the Netanyahu era. Beyond that, we move to a 4-party system. We raise the electoral to the point where only the largest parties can get elected. I don't know. I don't know if it can really work in Israel. We're a coalition system because we are, in some sense, an anarchic society. We do things here that you in Canada would never do. You know? We're very flexible in good ways and less good ways with the rule. And that just doesn't happen, you know. So
No, we like our rules here. We definitely do.
I'll tell. Yeah, yeah. I have a Canadian story about that.
Oh yeah.
My my laptop. I was visiting Toronto, and my laptop became functional. I had to buy a new laptop, and this goes back, I don't know, 10 years. And so they had to install all the programs. They said they needed to do it overnight. I said, how long will it take? They said, well, it's 3 or 4 days. I said, well, look, I'm leaving tomorrow. And they said, well, we have a waiting list. Well, can you just move me to the front of the list because I'm leaving tomorrow? The salesman looked at me with horror. He said, sir, you cannot discriminate against other customers here. And it like turned into, you know, a Canadian Lives Matter moment. And it was really, it was just one of those Israeli meets Canada. And I was just thinking, if this were Israel, of course, you know, look, I'm leaving tomorrow. Yeah, no problem.
Well, because it is where the beginning of the line is behind me, right?
That's right. But the negative side of that is what's playing out in the Knesset today. Is, well, wait a minute, but the Knesset just voted. How does the speaker cancel a vote? It flies in the face of the Knesset's own regulations. Well, it's Israel. So good ways and less good ways.
Let me see if we can do a couple of rapid fire in the 10 minutes or so that we have left here. How do we rapid fire on this one? How do we resolve the fact that Americans feel that Israel could not survive without the US, but Israelis think that Israel can survive on its own?
I wouldn't frame it in that in Israel America. I would frame it more within a Jewish peoplehood. I don't believe that either center of Jewish life, and there are now two centers, the overwhelming majority either in Israel or in North America, over 90%. Jewish people will not thrive if these two centers are alienated from each other. And that has to be the most urgent foreign policy mission of the Jewish people in the 21st century, making sure that these two very different communities that live in diametrically opposing circumstances and that have devised opposite strategies for coping with their circumstances. You know, in Israel, we relate to our hostile regional environment through deterrence. And in North America, you relate to your accepting environment with flexibility and openness. And these are two necessary strategies for coping with very different circumstances. But as a result of that, we no longer speak the same Jewish language. And that's what we need to be working on. So for me, the question is, isn't so much can Israel survive without American support? I think American foreign aid to Israel stopped tomorrow, it would be a major shock for Israel, but we would survive. We would get by. We have other alliances, the economy, you know, it's not the same Israel as it was 40 years ago or even 20 years ago. But can Israel survive a severance within the Jewish people? Can North American Jewry survive without being nurtured by Israel? I don't want to test those questions.
Right, and I see those lines drawn, you know, again, as we've said, along, you know, religious and secular, or religious and or traditional and pluralistic lines as well, as we see a halving of North American Jewish society, where we're seeing, you know, in New York and stuff today, just a complete disconnect from what we thought were communal Jewish values. This is in terms of the COVID thing, but we see it on other things as well. And so that alignment that you talk about with the Israeli Center as being so critical for North American to Jewish diaspora relations and Israel is really, I think, an important one for us to remember. So we've got just a few more minutes, and I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to tell us a hopeful story as well. Sure. At the end. So, so let me turn to that. The remaining questions here, although fascinating, and I'm sorry, Adi, that I can't get to all of yours. We did answer one or two of them. One of our members who made Aliyah has moved back to Vancouver since then, and asks about how Israel's handling Aliyah during the COVID crisis and with New Olim. I'm not sure that you're able to speak to that. Another question about the representation of Israelis, of Arab Israelis and Ethiopian Israelis in the protests. I don't know if you can speak to that, or to just to give us some sense of hope as you try to put a nechemta on this whole thing.
Well, for me, one of the most hopeful developments of this period is what's happening with the Arab-Israeli community. This is Israel's first major crisis that has nothing to do with security. It's nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And it's our first civic existential threat. And what we're seeing is that the Arab-Israeli community has played a major role in trying to figure out how we as a society push back against Corona. And the reason for that, the reason for this outsized role is because 20+% of Israeli doctors are Arab. 30+% of our nurses are Arab, and over 50% of our pharmacists. And so if there was any civic national emergency that was tailor-made to help bring Arab Israelis into the mainstream, it would be an emergency. And they have stepped up as a community, and there are extraordinary stories and images, photographs that have come out of Arabs and Jews praying together. There's one image that went viral in Israel. I don't know if you saw this. It was a team of medics, an Arab and a Jewish medic in Beersheba in the south. And they parked their ambulance on the street, and the Arab medic rolls out his prayer rug and prays, and the Jewish medic puts on a talit. And they were just standing there next to each other. And this image, as I say, this became the iconic image of the first wave of Corona. And what was so beautiful about it was the two guys were interviewed afterwards, and they both said how taken aback they were by all the attention. They said, for us, this is just what we do. This is just the most natural thing. You know, why are people making a big deal out of two religious people who work together, are medics? And so Israel's health system is extraordinary, and it is the most integrated place in Israeli society. You go into Israeli hospitals and you'll see Arabs and Jews really experiencing a level of intimacy that we rarely do in other parts of the society. So one result of this embrace that Arab Israelis have experienced is that, according to one recent poll, a slight majority of Arab Israelis say they are proud to be citizens of Israel. Now that's I think something to really build a civil society on. And that gives me a great deal of hope. And the thing about Israel, maybe with this I'll wrap up, is that you can never freeze the frame to a given moment and say, this is Israel. You know, I'd mentioned earlier that I moved to Israel in 1982, summer of 82. It was the beginning of the first Lebanon War, right before the Sabra and Shatila massacre. It was a terrible time. Really, it was Israel's first war that didn't bring the country together. It was actually the war that was tearing us apart. For the first time, we had anti-war demonstrations while soldiers are at the front. We'd never experienced anything like that before or after. And to come as an immigrant, as an Oleh, right into the schism was really entering one of the lowest points in Israel's history. And what I learned from that experience is that sometimes it's good to start out on the bottom because it just looks up from there. And we've had some really awful moments. Second Intifada, the 4 years of suicide bombing. We've had some traumatic times here. And this is an awful moment right now. But I feel that there is a basic trajectory in Israeli society of common sense and of at least minimal cohesion. And I have great faith in the innate wisdom of the wisdom of survival of Israelis and our coping mechanism. And I think that we're going to look back on this time and shake our heads and just say, wow, that was pretty bad, but we will have been past it.
As they say, your mouth to God's ears, that we come out of this
Yes.
stronger for having been through it. That's certainly been the history of our people, right? Yossi, thank you so much for your time. I know it's getting late in Israel. You have given us much to keep us awake with and to think about. It's been fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. I do hope that you're able to visit your daughter, and when you do come out to Vancouver, that we're able to get together and with our community.
I look forward to that.
But the other communities, and I know my colleagues in Vancouver, we've all big fans and appreciate.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Much. And I really look forward to seeing you in Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Let me know.
So that concludes our webinar. Thank you all for joining us. I'll just again draw your attention to the screen for a moment that we have beginning this Saturday night on October 24th. The first in our film series, The Social Dilemma, a discussion of this very important film about the role of social media in our society. We're joined in that with two eminent scholars in the field, Dr. Alfred Hamida and Professor Howard Edelman, both doctors as a matter of fact. And then 2 weeks later, Just Mercy, a discussion there, and all of that is available on our website. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Yossi. Please, everyone, stay safe. Join us online for all of our programs and services, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Yossi. Take care.
Be well.
Bye.